I remember the exact moment I stopped being afraid of losing everything. It was a Tuesday morning in March, and I was sitting across a conference table from my brother and sister, watching them divide my life into line items on a spreadsheet. My brother had flown in from Seattle the night before, the first time he'd been back in almost 3 years. My sister had driven up from Austin. They both looked rested, they both looked certain. And when my brother slid that document across the table and said, "We think this is fair," I looked down at the numbers, looked back up at his face, and felt something in me go completely still. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Carol, who had been taking notes furiously since we sat down, leaned over and whispered, "Claire, don't say anything yet." I nodded. But I already knew what I was going to say. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old, and for the past 6 years, I was the only one of my father's 3 children who actually showed up. My father, Daniel, was an electrician for most of his life. He built a small business in our hometown of Greenfield, Ohio, nothing glamorous, just reliable work, a loyal client base, and a reputation that took him 30 years to earn. He also owned the house I grew up in, a 2-story colonial on Maplewood Drive with a detached garage he used as a second office. By most measures, it wasn't a fortune. But to our family, it was everything. Dad was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's when I was 24. I had just finished my second year working as an office manager for a dental practice in Columbus, 40 minutes away. I had an apartment, a routine, and plans, vague ones, but still mine. Then I got the call from his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who had found him sitting in the driveway at 2 in the morning, confused about where he was. I drove home that weekend and never really moved back out. My brother Ryan was 28 at the time, already married, living in Seattle where he worked in software sales. He called once a week at first, then every few weeks, then on holidays. He sent money occasionally, a few $100s here and there, always accompanied by a text explaining how tight things were, how the mortgage was brutal, how he was doing what he could. I never asked him for anything. I just kept handling what needed handling. My sister Melissa was 25, in Austin, working in marketing. She was closer in personality to Ryan than to me. Both of them had always been comfortable with distance, with leaving, with the idea that geography was a valid substitute for presence. Melissa came home twice in 6 years. Once for Thanksgiving 2 years after Dad's diagnosis, when things were still manageable. Once more when he entered the second stage, for a weekend, when she cried a lot and then drove back to Austin and sent a flower arrangement to the house. I don't say this to make them sound like monsters. I say it because it matters for what came later. What those 6 years actually looked like. I reduced my hours at work to part-time for 2 years, then took a fully remote administrative job that paid less but allowed me to be home. I learned about medication schedules, fall prevention, sleep disruption, and the particular cruelty of watching someone's mind stay sharp while their body slowly refuses to cooperate. I drove Dad to every appointment. I managed his business finances, then helped him close the business gracefully when he could no longer work, preserving his relationships with clients so they left on good terms. I sat with him on the porch in the evenings and listened to him tell stories I had already heard 100 times, because the telling of them made him feel whole. Dad was lucid enough, for most of that time, to know exactly what was happening. He watched me rearrange my life around his, and he didn't pretend not to notice. About 2 years before he passed, he asked me to come sit with him in the kitchen after dinner. He had a folder on the table, the kind of manila folder he used to keep invoices in, edges worn soft. Inside was a handwritten letter, a copy of his updated will, and some paperwork I didn't fully understand at the time. He walked me through it slowly, in the measured way he did everything by then. "I know this isn't what you signed up for," he said. I told him to stop. "I mean it," he said. "Ryan and Melissa, they have their own lives. I'm not angry at them. But you gave up yours, and I see that. I want you to know I see that." We talked for almost 2 hours that night. He explained what he wanted to happen with the house, with his remaining savings, with everything. He'd already spoken with his attorney, a man named Gerald Watts who had handled his business contracts for 20 years. There were things in place, he told me. Things that would take time to understand but that he wanted me to know about. I didn't ask too many questions that night. I just held his hand and told him I would be okay. He passed away 14 months later, on a quiet Sunday morning in October, with me sitting in the chair beside his bed. Ryan arrived 2 days later. Melissa the day after that. The funeral was hard in the way funerals are. People said the right things. The weather was gray, and we stood at the graveside like three strangers who happened to share a last name. Ryan gave a eulogy that was technically accurate and emotionally empty. Melissa cried. I stood very still and thought about the folder on the kitchen table. The week after the funeral, Gerald Watts called to schedule a reading of the will. I will not pretend I knew exactly what was in that will before we sat down in Gerald's office. I knew some of what my father had told me. I knew the house was addressed. I knew there were provisions about his savings, and about a caregiver compensation clause that Gerald had helped him formalize, something that acknowledged, in legal terms, the financial and personal cost of what I had done. I knew Dad had been thoughtful and deliberate. But I did not know every detail. What I did know was that Ryan and Melissa were going to be unhappy. Ryan's face during the reading was a study in controlled fury. Melissa kept glancing at him like she was waiting for permission to feel whatever he was about to feel. When Gerald finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable for everyone in the room except, apparently, Gerald, who had seen this before. This doesn't seem equitable, Ryan said finally. Gerald explained, patiently, that the will was legally sound and had been prepared with full capacity by their father 14 months prior. The house should be split 3 ways, Melissa said. That's what family does. I didn't say anything. What the will specified, the house and its contents were left to me, with the condition that I maintain it for a minimum of 2 years before selling if I chose to. Dad's savings, roughly $47,000, were to be divided equally among the 3 of us after the caregiver compensation clause was settled. That clause specified a formal reimbursement for documented caregiver services rendered over 6 years, calculated at a modest hourly rate well below what a professional caregiver would have charged. After that calculation, the remaining savings divided 3 ways were considerably less than Ryan and Melissa had been expecting. Ryan hired an attorney within the week. His argument was that the will should be contested on the grounds that Dad had not been of sound mind when he revised it. It was a weak argument. Dad's doctors had documented his cognitive clarity repeatedly, and Gerald had notarized the will in the presence of 2 witnesses, but Ryan was committed. He was also, I discovered, significantly in debt. The Seattle mortgage he'd mentioned in his texts was real. The tightness he'd described was real. He needed money, and he had decided the house was where it was coming from. Melissa, to her credit, didn't fully commit to his strategy. She hired her own attorney, a younger man named Derek who seemed vaguely embarrassed by the situation, and initially filed separately. But within a month, she and Ryan had aligned. 2 attorneys, 1 shared goal: force a sale of the house and split the proceeds 3 ways. Carol came into my life through a recommendation from Gerald, who handled wills but not litigation. She was 53. Had been doing estate and family law for 25 years, and had the particular calm of someone who has watched versions of this story many times and no longer finds it surprising. She reviewed everything, the will, the caregiver clause, the property records, and told me my position was strong. They're going to make this unpleasant, she said, but they don't have a compelling legal case. I know, I said. You don't have to settle. You can let this go to a judge. I know that too, I said. What I didn't tell Carol yet was that I had already been in several conversations with Gerald about a different set of documents, the ones Dad had mentioned in that kitchen folder, the ones I hadn't fully understood at the time. Over the months since Dad's death, Gerald and I had worked through them carefully. There were things in place, Dad had said. He had not been exaggerating. The mediation was scheduled for a Thursday in April, 4 months after Dad's death. We met in a conference room on the 4th floor of a building downtown, me and Carol on one side, Ryan and his attorney on the other, Melissa and Derek at the far end. A mediator named Philip sat at the head of the table and explained the ground rules in the tone of someone who had learned not to expect them to be followed. Ryan's attorney opened with a valuation of the house. Greenfield's market had moved well in recent years. The property on Maplewood Drive was now worth approximately $340,000. He laid out their position. The house should be sold, proceeds split 3 ways, end of discussion. He was confident and organized. He had prepared well. I listened. Carol took notes. Then Ryan himself spoke, which his attorney had probably advised against. He leaned forward and said, I know this is hard, Claire, but Dad wasn't thinking clearly when he changed that will. You were the only one with access to him for years. You had influence over him. We're not saying you did anything intentional, we're saying the situation wasn't fair. I looked at him for a moment. He looked back at me. There was something genuinely convincing in his expression, not malice, exactly, but the particular self-righteousness of someone who has told himself a story so many times he now believes it completely. In his version, I had not sacrificed 6 years of my life. In his version, I had simply been the one who stayed, and staying had given me an unfair advantage, and the house was the correction for that imbalance. Melissa didn't say anything. She looked at the table. Carol began to speak, laying out my position, the legal validity of the will, the documented caregiver services, the absence of any evidence of undue influence. She was precise and measured. Ryan's attorney pushed back. Melissa's attorney said little. Philip attempted to move toward a number. Ryan's attorney eventually proposed a buyout. If I wanted to keep the house, I could pay each sibling $80,000, a total of $160,000 within 90 days. If I couldn't, the house would be sold and split equally. I didn't have $160,000. Ryan knew that. I felt Carol's hand near mine on the table, a slight movement, a signal to wait. I had told her before the mediation that I wanted to hear everything before I responded to anything. She had agreed, but I could tell she was ready to fight. Philip looked at me. The room was quiet. I said, "Give it all to them." Carol turned to look at me. Ryan blinked. "I'm sorry?" his attorney said. "The house," I said. "I'll sign it over. They can have it." There was a beat of stunned silence, the kind that fills a room completely, where even the sound of the air conditioning seems to pause. Carol said, quietly but firmly, "Claire, I need a moment with my client." Philip nodded and suggested a short recess. Ryan and Melissa and their attorneys filed into the hallway. Carol waited until the door was fully closed, then turned to me with an expression I can only describe as professional alarm. "Walk me through what you're thinking," she said. "Right now." "I've already thought it through," I said. "Claire, that house is worth $340,000. You cannot simply—" "I know what it's worth," I said. "I know what I'm doing." She looked at me for a long moment. She was trying to read whether I was acting out of grief, out of exhaustion, out of some collapsed impulse to just end the conflict. I understood why she couldn't tell. I hadn't told her everything. "There's a meeting with Gerald tomorrow," I said. "Can you be there?" She said yes, slowly. We went back into the conference room. What happened next took less time than I expected. I agreed in principle to transfer my interest in the house, conditional on a formal settlement agreement releasing all further claims against the estate, the caregiver compensation clause, and against me personally. Ryan's attorney drafted quickly. He was clearly surprised and wanted to close before I changed my mind. By the end of the afternoon, we had a signed term sheet. Ryan shook my hand. His grip was firm, and his smile was the smile of someone who believes he has just won. Melissa hugged me in the parking lot, briefly. She said, "I'm really glad we could work this out." I nodded and told her to drive safely. Carol walked with me to my car in silence. "Before I got in," she said, "I need you to tell me that you know what you just did." "I know exactly what I did," I said. "Come to Gerald's office tomorrow morning. I'll explain everything." Her expression was unreadable. I drove home to the house on Maplewood Drive, went into my father's kitchen, and made a cup of tea. What I had known, what my father had told me in that kitchen 2 years before he died, what Gerald and I had spent months carefully formalizing was this. The house had been worth very little to me in the way Ryan and Melissa understood value. 3 years before his death, when his diagnosis had progressed enough that he was thinking practically about the future, my father had added my name to a small LLC he'd created years ago to hold some business assets. Originally, it was just a vehicle for tax purposes, a simple structure Gerald had suggested when Dad's business was at its most profitable. By the time Dad revised his estate plan, that LLC held something far more valuable than the house. Dad's electrical business had generated long-term service contracts with 4 commercial clients, a small manufacturing company, 2 property management firms, and a regional hardware chain, all of whom had been his customers for over a decade. When he closed his business, he had not simply walked away from those relationships. He had formalized them. Gerald helped him structure a consulting arrangement that transferred those client relationships to the LLC, along with his licensing credentials, his supplier contacts, and the vendor pricing agreements he'd earned through years of volume. At current renewal rates, those contracts were generating a reliable base of about $6,000 per month in referral and management fees, routed through the LLC, of which I was the sole remaining member after Dad's passing. The house was an asset on paper. The LLC was a business. The caregiver compensation clause had been designed not just as a moral acknowledgement, but as a legal mechanism it established, formally, that my contributions had been a form of service to the estate, not merely a personal choice, which had implications for how the estate's assets were categorized and distributed. Ryan and Melissa had seen the house. They had seen the savings account. They had looked at the will and done the arithmetic. Neither of them had asked about the LLC, and their attorneys focused on the real estate had not looked deeply enough to find it, or if they had found it, had not understood what it was or what it contained. Dad had known what he was doing. He had watched his son and daughter drift away, and he had not been bitter, but he had been clear-eyed. He had built something that would protect the daughter who stayed, and he had built it in the kind of language that required patience to read. When Carol came to Gerald's office the next morning, I watched her face as Gerald walked through the LLC structure, the contracts, the revenue, the formal assignment of membership interests that had occurred months before the estate proceedings. She was quiet for a long time after he finished. Then she said, "They settled for the house." "Yes," I said. "And you let them?" "Yes." She leaned back in her chair. "Claire, the house is worth $340,000. The LLC, over 5 years at current contract rates, conservatively." "I know," I said. She looked at me the way people look at something they weren't expecting. "Your father planned this." "He was an electrician," I said. "He spent his whole life knowing exactly where the current was and where it wasn't." The settlement was finalized 2 weeks later. Ryan received his share of the house sale proceeds. Melissa received hers. Ryan called me once, about 3 months later, to say that the house had listed and was under contract. He sounded satisfied. I wished him well and told him I was happy for him. I was living in a rented apartment by then, a clean, quiet 2-bedroom on the east side of Greenfield, 5 minutes from the office space I had leased for the LLC. I had spent the months since the mediation building what my father had started, hiring a part-time project manager, renewing the commercial contracts personally, and beginning to add new clients through the network he'd left me. The revenue was growing. The business was mine, fully and legally and without anyone's ability to contest it. There is a question I imagine people asking when they hear this story, and I want to answer it honestly. Did it hurt to give up the house? Yes. It hurt more than I expected, and in ways I didn't anticipate. The house was where I had learned to be a daughter. It was the place where I sat on the porch with my father in the evenings and listened to stories I could recite from memory. Leaving it was not painless, and no legal structure made it otherwise. But I understood something that Ryan and Melissa did not, and that I think my father understood better than anyone. The house was the past, the LLC was the future. And the past, as beautiful and important as it is not where you build a life. My father did not leave me a house. He left me something harder to see: a foundation, a set of relationships, a mechanism by which his work could continue and grow through me. He trusted me with the real thing, not the symbol. And when they demanded everything, the symbol, the number on the page, the thing that looked like winning, I let them have it, because I already had what mattered. About 8 months after the mediation, I ran into Melissa at a grocery store in Greenfield. She was visiting a college friend, she said. We stood in the bread aisle and talked for a few minutes, not warmly, but not coldly either. She asked how I was doing. I told her I was doing well. The business was growing. I had just signed a new commercial client. She nodded and said, "That's good. I'm glad." I think she meant it. I think, in her own way, she understood something had shifted, even if she didn't know the specifics. There was a look on her face that I recognized, not guilt exactly, but a quiet awareness that the story she had told herself about the mediation was not the complete one. We said goodbye and went our separate directions down the aisle. I finished my shopping, loaded my car, and drove back to the office. I had a renewal meeting that afternoon with the manufacturing company, one of the original 4 clients, the longest relationship in the whole network. The owner had known my father for 14 years. When I had come to introduce myself as his successor, he had looked at me carefully across his desk and said, "Danny talked about you a lot. Said you were the one who got things done." I had thanked him, and we had shaken hands, and I had walked out of that building feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt like exactly who I was supposed to be. There are things I know now that I wish I had known 6 years ago. When I first drove back to Greenfield and walked into a situation I didn't choose and couldn't have fully anticipated. I know that care is a form of work, and that work deserves to be named and valued clearly. I know that the people who leave do not always understand what they've left, and that their not understanding it does not change what it cost. I know that legal documents, properly prepared by people who take the time to think about the future, can do more than protect you. They can honor you, in writing, in ways that matter when everything else is contested. And I know this. The most powerful thing you can sometimes say is nothing. The most powerful thing you can sometimes do is let someone take what they want and trust that you are already holding something they cannot see. My father built things that lasted. He built them carefully, with the right materials, in the right structure. He built some of them out of wire and junction boxes, and he built others out of contracts and patience and love that was not always visible but was always there. I think about him every morning when I unlock the office. I think about him when I sit across from a client who shakes my hand because my father shook his hand first. I think about him when I look at the numbers at the end of the month and see them moving in the direction he intended. He was right about everything. And when the moment came when they pushed the document across the table and told me to choose, I chose the way he taught me, not by fighting for what was visible, by holding on to what was real. Give it all to them. Sometimes that is the sentence that ends one story and begins another. This is mine.